Hello, everybody, and welcome to Symmetry Live. This is Natasha Helfer, and I am super thrilled, as usual, to have part of my team here with me today. Hello, Lindsay from Colorado. Hello, Lisa from Idaho. Super excited to have you both. We try to do these almost every Friday, as long as we're kind of around. Sometimes Fridays are weekends that are holidays or things, so we don't. But almost every Friday, you can hit us up around lunchtime, and we love to hear from you. We love to hear comments. We love to hear questions that either have to do with what we're talking about today, or if you have a question you want us to address in the future, we'd love to hear from you. And if you want to know more about us, you can find us at symmetrysouls.com. But today, we are going to talk about the feeling of being right. And it was funny because one of our other team persons that would have loved to join us today, who's Jana Spangler, she's like, "Oh, I'm a right fighter." I'm a recovering right fighter. Meaning that we can get very caught up in this sense of being right. And one of the things I really want to kind of unpack a little bit today with the two of you is how I think most people come to the idea that I'm correct or right, thinking it's logical. Like I've thought through it. I've like gathered my information, and now I've come to this conclusion and I'm right. And I did that because I'm smart and logical and reasonable. And we totally lose sight of the fact that that's actually a much more emotional process than it is a logical one. And then, of course, when we have that thought process, it's very seductive to then, of course, assume that everybody else who has a different opinion is illogical and wrong and emotional, because
and perhaps stupid and or evil.
And evil. What else?
I mean, I think it really does come down to like either they don't know what I know,
Clearly.
or they're stupid, or they're evil. I mean, that pretty much sums it up, I think. And, like logically, we can sort of like sit back and be like, well, probably not everybody who disagrees with me is stupid, evil, and or ignorant. Probably. Maybe. But yeah, I mean, like the feeling of being right is incredibly pleasurable, right? Like, and this starts really, really early at like babies, right? Like, oh, if I flip this switch, I figured it out. I'm right. Like, ooh, the light comes on. That's very pleasurable. Like, how many 2-year-olds just want to sit turning the light on and off for an hour, right? Like, they are basking in the pleasure of being right, like predicting an outcome and then like, woo, right? And there's just no way to get around it. This is the way we're programmed, for good reason, by evolution, to find being right incredibly pleasurable. It feels so good. It's sort of like anger, like self-righteousness. It feels so good. It feels so good in a bad way sometimes, but it feels so good.
It's good. Isn't it good?
It does feel good. And it's mostly a feeling, right? Like if you've ever like I love the posing of this question of how does it feel to be wrong? And people will be like, oh, it's embarrassing. It's like, no, it's not. Like, being wrong feels fine. It's realizing you were wrong that feels terrible. Right? Like,
well, parse that out a little bit. What do you mean by that?
well, being wrong feels just like being right. Like, unless you realize you were wrong, then being wrong and being right feel exactly the same way. It's realizing that you were wrong that feels embarrassing and shameful, right? Like, we all just assume we're right until we're proven otherwise, right? And so being wrong feels exactly like being right. Until you realize you're wrong, and realizing you're wrong feels terrible. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. It feels like just, oh, let's avoid that feeling, right? And so we'll do a lot to avoid feeling like we were wrong, because feeling right feels pleasurable, and feeling wrong, realizing that you were wrong feels terrible.
Yeah, no, for real. And then add to it some cultural overlays, I think, too, where I've seen, especially I think both in I guess political and religious communities, which seems to be a lot of what we're kind of in these days, um, being wrong or admitting you're wrong is posed as either weak or wishy-washy or not standing for your convictions, because somehow if you go through that process of changing your mind or expanding your view, that's seen as not desirable. So I don't know, Lindsay, what are your thoughts about kind of just even the perceptions of culturally how people think about being right or wrong?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I definitely think that for some reason, it's considered weak to admit that you might have been wrong. And yet we live in a society that touts like open-mindedness and looking at different sides of everything. And so I think that's kind of a conflict there, because we're telling everyone, oh, but you should look at both sides, but really you should look at my side because it's the right side. It's like it's not even being fair to people when we claim that we want people to be open-minded, but clearly there's a right and a wrong idea there. That's not really accurate necessarily.
Yeah, I really like this idea of emotion and logic and kind of us being willing to think about that differently. We know just from, again, a cultural lens that emotion tends to be seen as weak or incorrect, a little like unhinged, versus logic. It's kind of like reason, and we tend to tout it as something we want to emulate or attain, is achieving decisions through a logical process. Maybe this is, somewhat like the scientific method or some of our intellectual ideas about how life should be, etc. The problem is that even through the scientific method, we know that those two things are not really, like, you can't totally separate them, first of all. And then I think the other problem that happens is that these are very gendered ideas. So, like, in general, female folks tend to be deemed, emotional, and male folks tend to be deemed rational. And I really loved it in today's provider meeting, Lisa, when you said, but feeling right is the most emotional feeling, and I was like, ding, 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 like, yes, it's not, you think you come to it from this logical conclusion, but you're having an emotional response. And even information going into your brain kind of in an intellectualized, what we would deem reasonable way, is sifting through emotional experiences of yours, right? And that's why, and we've talked about this many times before in kind of different contexts, why people can take the same material, the same logical material, you can read the same book, you can, look at the same equation and come out with very different conclusions or ideas about that. And until I think we really get into a humble space as humans, knowing that we are all subject to that, not just, yeah, I can talk about this, but it's really just you that's doing this. And until we all kind of sit with that discomfort of, oh crap, this affects me too, I don't know that we're going to get very far in a lot of, especially the global kind of issues that we're trying to, kind of manage these days, like Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, systemic racism, a lot of like the political and religious divides that we see. I mean, those are big, systemic, millennia long problems, right? That are going to take, I think, a lot of humility for us to really kind of sit with how I come to terms with my ideas about any and all of those things. Yeah, no, tell me, what are you guys thinking?
Well, like one of the things that was coming to mind for me is I will often have couples come in, and like you said, it's often gendered, but I would say it's like 60-40. Like 60% of the time, the couple is saying that the man is logical and the woman's emotional. But, about 40% of the time, they're saying like, oh, she's so logical and I'm so emotional. And like, I really try to reframe that, because it's generally speaking, the person who is being framed in that relationship as being the logical one. They're the one who is talking fast and like is the right fighter, thinks they're right, has lots of things to say, right? Like they're being framed as logical, but they're no more logical than the other person. They're just better at talking fast, thinking they're right, and like framing their emotional responses in terms of logic, right? Like they're not any more logical, 0% more logical. And like helping people to see that, like your framing of like, well, you're the logical one, I'm the emotional one. Your logic is just coming out as like, I'm right, I'm going to talk fast, I'm going to try and convince you that I'm right, right? Like that is not logical. That is still emotional. And that happens a lot in political contexts or in family contexts, or in, like there are a lot of ways that, like we sort of frame these very not logical thinking I'm right things as being logical or being reasonable. And which isn't to say that, like this is the thing I've struggled with, is like, okay, so because being right is bad for relationships. I mean, I will just say that, right? Like if you want to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't agree with you about everything, and who are you going to find who agrees with you about everything? Then being right and being really like addicted to that feeling is not going to be good for relationships, because either you're going to bully people into pretending like they agree with you, or you're going to constantly feel like they're not validating you because they're not saying you're right all the time. Or, you know what I mean? Like there's no way to put yourself up here as like, I'm right, and have a really connected relationship with someone, because either they have to agree with you all the time, or they have to lie with you, or lie to you, or there's going to be conflict. Being right is just bad for relationships.
Yeah.
It's a bad tool for relationships.
I think we need to kind of realize that it's not a black and white thing. It's not either you are right or you are wrong. Maybe there's, I don't know what the word would be, but there's, there's something in the middle that makes it a little bit, I guess, because I think because we don't want to feel wrong or recognize that we were wrong, so we'll do anything to stay with that belief that we are right. But if we could find a way to be like, well, maybe this is a gray area and there's not a right or wrong to every single situation, but we tend to think that way. I mean, for sure.
Yeah.
I think too, like when I think the first time I had this realization pretty deeply, it was in the context of having a conversation with my adult siblings once we were all kind of adult, and talking about our parents and our, kind of our experience growing up in the home that we grew up in. And I guess I came into that conversation assuming, of course, we would all think the same thing. Like of course, we would have the same experience. We all had the same parents. I was there for half of the experiences we were talking about. I would assume we'd have the same feelings. And it was really eye-opening to see how differently they either placed blame or understood things differently, or even just remembered things quite differently than I was remembering, as far as certain conversations or certain occurrences. And that at the time was really upsetting to me and difficult, because I was like, geez, if I can't even be on the same page with, there's 4 of us, so the 3 of you, on these things that I thought was just common sense, how are we ever gonna get anywhere, And yet, what I found over the years, and maybe my training in marriage and family therapy helped me open up in this way, was like, oh, instead of that being a negative, now I can see different possibilities, that weren't necessarily even in my awareness. And like you're talking about, Lisa, with couples, like we work a lot with mixed faith couples, people, like one person who's maybe leaving a church or faith culture, and one person who's staying. And I get a lot of these very black and white, type of complaints from both parties, like the one person, how can you not see it how I do, especially if they're thinking about it from like a harmful approach, like the church is harmful. The church harmed me. It harmed my ability to A, B, C, or D, and it's going to harm our children. And yet the other person saying that the church is super helpful, and I find a lot of value in it, and both are kind of like ships crossing in the sea, like I can't see it your way, and and you can't see it mine, and how can this be? And then the meaning ruts that get inserted, like this means that you don't trust me, that you don't believe me, that you're not with me, right? And so imagine in a marriage, that starts getting very to the core of kind of like our needs, right? Of feeling like you've got that person who's got your back, right? And so it starts really interfering with that feeling. And I do see it as fairly similar to kind of a family system, like whether, in some families, there's people who are like, I feel like mom or dad or both were abusive, I'm going to cut off. Other people are like, well, I feel like mom or dad were problematic, but I still find value in my relationship with them. I'm going to have some boundaries, but still have a relationship with them, right? And so you can see even in that situation, siblings having very different ideas about how they can play a role. And I think this goes back to this whole I'm right and I have figured it out, and why isn't it everybody doing it my way? I don't know. Did I
I mean, I think that discussion of needs is exactly right. Like how, because that's that question of like, what is that thing, and how do we move away from the black and white? Like I'm right and this is good or bad, or like, and I think that, like that needs discussion is exactly right, right? Like if we want to replace I'm right or this is right or I'm with something else, we can look at, okay, what needs are we all trying to meet in this context, right? Like what need am I trying to meet by being right about this? And what need is my partner trying to meet in her being right about her, like, and if we can dig down into, okay, well, what needs, if I'm really angry with the church because it's doing this harmful thing and this harmful thing and this harmful thing, what needs am I trying to meet by being right about that? And if my partner finds the church really helpful, what needs is she trying to meet in that, right? And it's usually you're meeting very different needs, and it helps us move away from who's right and who's wrong, and we just look at it through, okay, is this actually meeting the need, right? Like, is this an effective way to meet the need that I have and the way that you have? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes I do need to be angry at the church, and that is protecting me. That is giving me energy because faith transitions are hard, and sometimes you need some anger to navigate it, right? And sometimes you need to feel like you're right in order to move on. But recognizing that it is a feeling and that it is meeting a need for you rather than that is a logical fact, right? And that similarly, your partner is meeting their needs in a different way. Like her needs might be for community and support and for, like other things that you weren't factoring into your being right at all, right? Like, so recognizing that like I have needs, she has needs, and are the ways that we are working to meet those needs effective or not? And that's a good way to move away from like just being right as the thing that we need to save us all.
I wonder if we could reframe it even as instead of I'm right, just I'm right for me. This is right for me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those two words make a huge difference, because that is true. Some things are exactly what you're saying, Lisa. Some things are right for the different needs of different people. And if you're not thinking about it from their perspective, then it makes absolutely no sense to you.
I like that a lot. It's almost like this is my best thinking at this particular time, right? Or wouldn't it be awesome if we even said, this is my best thinking and feeling at this particular time? And, and I feel, pretty passionately about this, but that's not, we don't necessarily, I don't think that we've been role modeled how to use feeling language in our certainty kind of discussions, right? In that sense. And I think most of us grew up in systems in one way or another where, you know, the strength or the role modeling was about being right. Like, you know, we are Americans and we are the best, or this is the true church, or that, you know, God exists, or, you know, the Republicans or the Democrats, this is the right way, you know, and so we've been role modeled a lot of black and white, all or nothing type of language, and not so much this kind of nuanced middle ground space. So it's hard. We're not good at it. It doesn't come naturally. It doesn't feel as good. It doesn't feel as edifying in the moment.
And at the same time, you know, like being right as a tool, again, sometimes you need to be right. Like sometimes that as a tool is a really helpful way to meet certain needs. You know, like for instance, if there is an election, right? Like sometimes you know, like being very precise about how many votes went where, that is very important to be precise about those tools, right? And not to fudge or just get emotional and decide whose votes decide, right? Like, no, in that context, being right is super important, right?
Yeah.
However, in relationships, like when we're trying to meet the need of connection with somebody, and that's the need we're trying to meet, you know, like then the I'm correct and you're incorrect tool is not going to meet that need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. And this goes back to, I think we've talked about it quite a few times before, Jonathan Haidt's book, where, you know, he talks about the elephant and the rider, and, you know, that we have this kind of whole subconscious self that has all these lived experiences, even things we don't even remember from, you know, when we were babies and toddlers. I mean, it's amazing the research that comes out of how your experiences as a baby and toddler, things we don't even remember, still affect who we are today, very much so. And so we have that whole elephant, and we have the rider, you know, the brain part that has the conscious thinking part that I'm aware of. Thinking that I can control this elephant. And sometimes you can, you know, sometimes the elephant and the rider are in sync. A lot of times they're not, you know, and I think that's where that humility comes in. And the thing that I love the most that comes out of that book is that you can't change people's minds from a logical perspective, especially if they came to that conclusion emotionally, which I don't know almost anything that you can't come to at some level that doesn't have an emotional component to it. And why I think a lot of times people get so frustrated, because it's like, but this is the facts, and can't you read this, or can't you see that? And in some contexts, like you're saying, Lisa, it works. I mean, if you're taking algebra, you know, 1 in high school or whatever, that's a pretty good approach. But relationally speaking, people get very frustrated when they think that they're being very logical and proving a point that the other person is saying, mm-mm. And so we actually do better when we say things like you said, Lindsay, for me, or this is my experience, this is how I feel. Well, those are things that people can't necessarily prove or disprove, right? That's a lived experience. And that's, I think, where we communicate best, is through those things. But can you talk really quickly, Lisa? You said something this morning about Brene Brown's research and talking about shame and certainty. So can you just make that point really fast before we?
Yeah. So, you know, this is one of the things that she brings up, I think, in every one of her books and talks, is that like there's certain ways that we deal with shame, right? And one of the ways that we, you know, like when we're not being resilient to shame, when we're just covering it, like, oh, I have so many insecurities and I don't want to look at them, so I'm going to put them in a dark hole and put things on top, right? Like perfecting is one of them. Like I'm going to perfect myself, and if I'm just perfect. But one of the biggest ones is certainty, right? Like if I know that I'm right, then I don't have to think about the fact that I'm insecure or scared, or that I'm afraid people don't love me, or, you know, that I'm afraid people think I'm dumb or lazy, or whatever the shame thing is for you, right? Like being right is a way that we cover it, that we cover that up and hide away the insecurities underneath, right? So that's not like shame resilience, where we're really like digging into the shame and trying to like recover, right? It's really just like shoving the shame down deeper and putting certainty on top. And so certainty, like the more you feel it, the more that you're probably like covering up some shame.
Yeah. Awesome. We love Brene. She's the shame queen Bible person. So, Lindsay, any closing thoughts from you as far as feelings having to do with certainty?
No, I just really like that point that you can't argue with feelings. You just can't. Like, everyone has their own lived experience and their feelings about it. And so I like that, always coming from, well, this is how I feel. There's no way to counteract that. You can't argue feelings.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Yeah, so today is a loving invitation from the Symmetry Solutions team that every time we think we're right about something, and every time we think we're very smart about that, to just be open to the idea that there are emotions attached to this too, and that's actually not a bad thing. That's not something we have to dismiss or feel shame about, that we come to some of our conclusions through our emotional lived experiences. And it's not even we're not necessarily saying that feeling correct or feeling strongly about something is bad either. It's just kind of seeing it through a different lens is, I think, what we're trying to get at today. So
I
thank
think the question maybe that like we come to is this question of like, when I'm feeling very strongly that I'm right and frustrated that people aren't agreeing with me, what need am I trying to meet for myself in that?
you.
What emotional need would be met if I could just get everyone to agree with me?
Mhm.
Right? Like, and sometimes those needs are really valid. Like if your opinion is that people should be kinder to whatever group that you know, like if you're right about feminism or right about racism or right about like things that I definitely think I'm right about, right? Like generally speaking, the need underneath is super valid, right? Like I just want there to be equality and fairness, right? And so, you know, like it's not that like if you look at it underneath that you're wrong or that you're bad or that like there's nothing wrong with feeling right, but just recognizing that underneath that frustration and that certainty, you have an emotional need that you're trying to get met.
Love it. And Matt Fulmer, we see you watching us. Thank you. We see you watching us often. So thanks for tuning in. And this has been Symmetry Live with my fabulous team players, Lisa and Lindsay. And for those of you who are wanting to see what we're about, you can go to symmetrysouls.com. I'll make sure and put that link on the thread. Please reach out to us with questions or situations that maybe are going on in your lived experience that you'd like maybe our thoughts about. We try to do this every Friday. We offer both mental health and wellness coaching services across the United States. And if we're not a good fit, we're always happy to help you find a good fit. So reach out to us. And I hope everybody has a great weekend. This is February 5th. So we'll see you. Go have all your feelings about being right. Take care.